not to solve a problem with AI, but to create a system that is capable of solving problems. The general flexible intelligence that a human has. That's what they're trying to build. So they're not trying to make new tools for biology. They're trying to make mechanized biologists.
Welcome again to another episode in the Let People Prosper show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to bring on a guest who knows a lot about AI, technology, energy, and a whole bunch of other issues that we'll dive into today. And it's none other than Dean Ball. Dean, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Thanks so much for having me, Vance.
Well, it's really a pleasure to have you on the program. Looking forward to our discussion today. But before we get to all that, let me go ahead and read your bio for the audience. So, Dean Ball is research fellow at George Mason University's Mercatus Center and author of Substack Hyperdimensional. Should definitely check that out. I'll be sure to put that in the show notes page at vanceginn.substack.com. His work focuses on artificial intelligence, emerging technologies, and the future of governance. Previously, he was a senior program manager for the Hoover Institution's State and Local Governance Initiative. He has published on topics including AI, neural technology, biotechnology, political theory, public finance, infrastructure, and a whole bunch more. Prior to his role at Hoover Institution, he served as the executive director of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, based in Plymouth, Vermont, and Washington, D.C. He serves on the board of directors of the Alexander Hamilton Institute and on the advisory council of the Kroc Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue University. He graduated magna cum laude from Hamilton College in 2014 with a BA in history and currently resides in Washington, D.C. So with all that fun stuff going on, Dean, you're a busy man in a lot of ways. Let me go and ask you the first question I do all the guests. What motivates you to do what you do every day?
Well, I think that AI is going to be the most important sort of general purpose technology, or some people call them macro inventions of our time. And I think it's really easy to screw it up. We have a very pro-regulatory, just intellectual climate that we live in right now in this country. I think it's really easy to screw it up with policy, and it's really easy to mess it up in a variety of different ways. And I just find the challenge, I find the technology fascinating. I find the promise to be immense. I find the potential features we could create to be so amazing. And I just kind of am very, it feels like the highest and best use of my time to be helping, with that.
Yeah, no, I love it. And I agree with you. I think that's the next revolution, economic revolution and so forth, that's going to set us into the future for more progress and prosperity and everything else. What got you into AI? Yeah, because, while it's somewhat new, it's always kind of been around to some extent, but what really got you into it?
Well, I've been a tech nerd for my whole life. It wouldn't really show up on my resume exactly because I haven't done anything in tech, but I started writing code when I was a kid. Probably I was writing technical documentation and code for open source software projects at a pretty young age. So I've always kind of been interested in tech and followed the industry quite closely. And so I was paying attention when the deep learning revolution started. I was in college, and I was paying attention. I saw wow, look, it seems like there's some breakthroughs happening in AI. And gradually over the years, the amount of attention I paid increased, because first it was, we're solving the ability to recognize images, right? That was classifying the contents of an image. It was this incredibly hard problem. We got good at that around 2012. And then it was all of a sudden you're seeing board games, really hard, not chess, but Go, right? Really complicated board games like Go get solved at kind of superhuman level. And that was wow, okay. Yeah. And then, AlphaFold with the protein folding, it just seemed like major problem after major problem was just getting solved over and over and over again. It wasn't something that consumed my life, but I was paying some attention. And in fact, I remember when, a then completely unknown company in 2017 released this paper about language models and about how a very small language model, a very early predecessor of ChatGPT, could figure out, it could do emotion recognition. It was just trained to predict the next character of a sequence of text, but it could actually be a world-class, at the time, emotion, like sentiment analyzer for like the sentiment in the text. And that kind of seemed like, oh, wow, there's some deeper understanding going on there.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of things like that. And yeah, basically I've just been paying attention. And then once the policy conversation sort of started to heat up, it was like, well, this feels like the time.
Yeah, this is home. This is where I need to go.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and there's so much that's surrounding it, whether it's the policy part or the technology that's behind it. There's a lot that's probably misunderstood about AI. I mean, whenever you talk to folks, in doing the work that you do, what are some of the things that you like to highlight about AI that maybe that we have a misperception about across much of the public?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that like one thing about AI that I think is really easy to misunderstand is kind of like what the nature of what is being built right now versus what we've seen so far. Because it's different, right? Like,
yeah,
like a lot of scientists, have been using various machine learning and AI methods for like the protein folding thing, right? It was like you input a bunch of protein sequences and then you eventually train a model that can predict the structure of a protein. Which was like a very, very difficult unsolved problem in science. It still is an unsolved problem in the sense like we don't know what the rules are, but like we kind of have a big neural network that can do like pretty good predictions. So that's like a kind of a way of analyzing data, which is really powerful and great. And there'll be more AI like that all the time. And it's going to be really powerful and valuable too. But like, that is not what a company like OpenAI is working on. What OpenAI is trying to do, or Anthropic or DeepMind, they're trying to build intelligence itself. Not to solve a problem with AI, but to create a system that is capable of solving problems. The general flexible intelligence that a human has. That's what they're trying to build. So like they're not trying to make new tools they're trying to make mechanized, right?
Yeah,
like,
that's a good point.
And so I think that's like, that often muddles conversations about AI. It's like, what are you talking about? Because they're like quite different things,
Yeah, definitely. And I want to get some more of that here in a little bit. Before we go too far, though, I also wanted to ask you a little bit about your time at the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. I got Amity Shlaes' book back here about Coolidge, and I've read a lot of his other stuff. He's one of my favorite presidents. And so I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about your time there.
Oh, it was an amazing place to work. It sounds like you worked for the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation in Plymouth, Vermont. It sounds like a sleepy little archival, organization. And like, indeed, at one point it was. But Amity Shlaes, the biographer of Coolidge, also happened to be just a phenomenally talented executive. And so she came into that organization with some other people and she supercharged the place. And so now they have like one of the most prominent, one of the most generous scholarships, undergraduate scholarships in America is run by the Coolidge Foundation. They have this nationwide speech and debate program for middle and high schoolers, a bunch of archival things. They have a big property in DC. They're just doing a million things. And despite all that, when I was executive director there, we had like 8 staff, including me. So it was like very small and startup like, and everyone's doing all this work all the time. And so it was like a very frenetic and like intense place to work, which you wouldn't have guessed from the name. But it was really amazing in so many different ways. And some of the most fulfilling work I've done, really, simply because at the foundation we were always trying to sort of build community and like do genuine like educational programming for young people. And so it was really cool when we could bring together, sort of very, very some of the brightest 16 and 17-year-olds in the whole country and teach them about the ideas that are, near and dear to our hearts and were near and dear to President Coolidge's heart.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, man, I'd love to hear some more stories at some point because I'm fascinated with Silent Cal and the things that he was able to do during that period. I've written quite a bit about with op-eds and stuff like that, of how we should be looking back to that period of time, the 20s, 1920s, on what was done then with spending restraint. A lot of the ideas in economics, as an economist, when you think about supply side economics, was actually Andrew Mellon and Calvin Coolidge and even Harding, before there became JFK and Ronald Reagan and all the other stuff. There was actually a lot of good stuff happening then when we balanced budgets and paid down the debt and did a lot of other great things that we need to be looking at today. Unfortunately, we're heading in a different direction. Maybe Trump will get headed right. We'll see. But I also wanted to get a little bit of your thought, Dean, on kind of like your worldview, being someone who did a lot of tech stuff in the past and other things, and being at the Coolidge Foundation. Are you more of a classical liberal, or how do you like to explain your worldview?
That's a great question. I would say I'm like pretty on the classical liberal side, like the founding principles of the American Republic are very important to me, and I try to understand them as the founders understood those things. And so definitely, I believe in a restrained role for government overall. That being said, like, I'm not dogmatic about anything. Yeah. And there are times, like there are, especially, as I've kind of like changed some of my opinions in the last few years about like, when does it make sense to do things like use tariffs or trade policy, or when does it make sense to like there are certain problems I've encountered, like just industrial gaps in America's the American economy, where it's like it's not obvious actually that markets solve this problem on their own, and so I've had like some corrections to that overall, but I would describe them as like sort of bumps in a line that is otherwise quite consistent. Yeah. And there's not too many of them, where like basically, like I'm a pretty I'm a pretty mainline classical liberal, but I would distinguish that from being like a libertarian. And I think it's like an important distinction,
Yeah. That makes sense. No, that makes sense there. Well, I really want to get into AI because there's so much that we can go into, and maybe I want to start it off with maybe what the perception is by some on the outside, and whenever they're looking at AI, is there's kind of this fear. What's it going to do to the economy? What's it going to do to the labor markets? Is it going to be a substitute, and it's going to drive off a lot of the employment that we have today? And, are there going to be the Terminators of the world or Iron Man, the people who are against him? Are there these fears that may seem reasonable on the outside, but also may have a lot of things that are going to help us progress and become more prosperous in the future? And of course, as Thomas Sowell said, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And I think these really bring up a lot of the trade-offs that are associated with AI. I think we believe that it's going to be more positive for the future, but I do at least acknowledge, that there will be trade-offs, that there will be issues in the labor market and things of that nature. But how might we think about those in a proper context in the framework of what's going on in AI and for the future of the country? Yeah.
It's a great question. So I always like, one of the primary ways I try to reason about this is history, and the history of technology in particular like fascinates me to no end. And I get asked a lot about like, oh, how do we make guardrails for AI, or how do we be sure the transition goes well? And I say, like, you and I are both in rooms right now that are painted white. The walls in the rooms that we're in are painted white. Yeah. And guess what? That's a fact that's downstream of electricity. If you look at houses, the insides of houses before electricity, the walls are dark green or dark red, and that wasn't like a change in design sensibilities. The reason that white paint became possible is because we moved away from gas lamps and the soot. And the soot, right? And so like that seems like a small thing, but then you also think about like, well, they also changed the role of domestic labor in the household, which gave rise to feminism. And they also changed the way that factories worked and enabled a whole new scale of factories, which in turn created a whole new system of labor, really, of industrial, management labor relations, and defined the way that we think about the relationship between management and labor today. All of that is like downstream of these macro inventions. And so I find it very, very, very hard to predict. And I find it very hard to tell people like, oh, here's some simple way that we can make this go well. Yeah. Other than just trying to have elect prudent representatives and hope that they, and hope that they exercise good judgment in a variety of different ways. But in terms of some of the more direct concerns that people have, I think labor market stuff. It's hard to say exactly. I think there's going to be some dislocation and some disruption, possibly quite a bit. It's hard to say how quickly it'll happen or how sort of time compressed it will be. Will there be a lot that happens in a year, or will there be a lot that happens in 15 years? Right? That's harder to say. But I think that overall, what we will see is I think the productivity gains are going to be immense. I think there will still continue to be things that we want humans to do, not because necessarily even humans are better at them, but because we just want humans to do them. It's a difficult thing to reason about because it is this this new invention, this macro invention that will change so much. But I find the history of technology to mostly be pretty compelling. And I think the true reality will just be that we end up doing things that we currently don't even have words for. That'll be a big chunk of the jobs that we end up doing. And I think that the productivity gains will be immense, and that there'll be just enormous amounts more wealth created. And also that the quality, the quality of life that you will be able to buy per dollar will just skyrocket with that productivity. And so I think I forget who it was I remember the historian of the economist Joel Mokyr said, one of the biggest, he parted ways with Milton Friedman and said, it's a misnomer that there are no free lunches. The history of technology is filled with free lunches. It is hard to predict this. The general outcome feels somewhat easier, but the specifics are very hard. I mean, I think what's probably important for us to at least acknowledge that there will be disruptions in the marketplace, but that happens all the time. I mean, that's part of creative destruction, going back to Joseph Schumpeter and thinking about too with Hayek's knowledge problem is we don't know exactly what's all going to be in the future. We don't know all the signals that are going to be in the marketplace. And when I'm talking to family and friends and they're asking me about AI, I'm usually like, look, it is going to have some disruptions, but we've dealt with disruptions in the past. We used to ride horse and buggy, then we went to a car. I don't know about you, but I don't want to ride a horse and buggy. I want to keep, riding cars and whatever, driving cars and see whatever's going to be in the future, along with improving our daily lives. I mean, if you think about the cell phones that we have in our pockets and these little computers now, was unheard of 20, 30 years ago. And the way that we have them now, it's dramatically improved my life. Maybe I'm on it too much. Maybe it's something else I need to work on. But I think that there are so many improvements that we have, to your point, that we really don't even know exactly what those jobs are going to be in the future. For example, there could be a lot of ways that AI replaces some of the monotonous things that we do, kind of like a lot of AI stuff that does even today, whether it's open AI with ChatGPT and things of that nature, helping us out with grocery lists or whatever else it may be. Who knows what's going to be in the future? And so from that perspective, I see it as being, not only prosperous, but something that's going to help us live our lives better spiritually, psychologically, socially. There will always be other things that help, hinder us in some capacity, but it is going to help us to progress and adapt more to changes within the environment and everything else around us. But it seems, Dean, that some people are willing to
push this more on a policy front. We've seen this in Texas. There's this TREGA bill that's supposed to be a responsible form of AI and helping out with regulations and putting in a framework, kind of like you mentioned earlier, to say, you know what, if we could just stay within these tracks, within these walls, then that will allow for responsible AI for the future. And of course, I push back on that, and I think many others have, including you, about what's happening in Texas. But what are some of your main concerns about what you see across the country and what the regulatory direction is?
Yeah, so I wish I could tell you that I look at the technology landscape and I feel like, man, we got a good trajectory. Like I think the pace of progress is going to be very, very rapid in AI. I wish I could tell you I look at the policy landscape and feel anything like that optimism, but I don't. Yeah. In fact, I think America's currently sleepwalking on a policy trajectory that really, like, if you ask it's like World War I, where like if you asked any individual of the major actors, any governor or state legislator, they would say, well, of course we don't want this to happen, but it's exactly what's going to happen if we don't step in and take leadership at some level. Because basically, sort of, I'll start out broad and then I'll go into Texas specifically. So there's going to be about probably 1,000 bills at the state level, AI bills introduced at the state level, not passed, but introduced. And one set of those bills, probably the most aggressive regulation of those bills, is this algorithmic discrimination framework, which came together out of this kind of multi-state legislator working group. So a bunch of legislators from different states got together under the auspices of this organization called the Future of Privacy Forum. They say they served as a neutral facilitator. Take that for what you will. But basically what came out of this is we have now about 20 states that have introduced this sort of very similar framework. And most of them, it's a combination of blue and red states. Most of them are blue, but some red states as well. And they're all more similar than they are alike, but they also do, it's funny because this is a group trying to, claiming that they're trying to avoid a regulatory patchwork, but even their thing is a regulatory patchwork.
Yeah.
Even these legislators together have made a regulatory patchwork. Huh. So the most aggressive probably of all the bills in America of this type that have been introduced is Texas's, which is really surprising. Yeah. Just coming from a red state, and especially Texas, which kind of prides itself on having a really clean regulatory environment. So basically what this bill does is it focuses on the concept of algorithmic discrimination, which is the idea that an algorithm might be biased against some civil rights protected group. And it creates liability for the developers and the users, meaning like corporate users. If you're a medium-sized corporation or bigger, you face liability. And the liability can be based on disparate impact-based theories of discrimination. So what that means is that even if you didn't intend to discriminate against some group of people, if your use of AI in some way had a negative effect on other people, on a differential impact on some specific civil rights group, protected group, then you can face liability under this law. And I mean, this is a standard, like the Trump administration is trying to push back against disparate impact standards right now. Yeah. It's been a cause for the right for a very long time to do, since before Trump, right? This has been a cause among like conservative legal theorists. In addition to that, it creates a massive paperwork compliance burden using kind of a risk-based framework, which is very similar to the European Union's AI Act. So most of this actually falls not on AI developers, not on the big tech companies. It falls on medium and sometimes small size businesses and large businesses operating in the state.
Yep.
And they have to do algorithmic impact assessments and have risk management plans. And on top of that, so Texas does all that. And on top of that, they're also creating a centralized regulator for AI, which I think is like one of the worst things you can do, just in general, for all kinds of political economy reasons I can get into.
Yeah.
But I would also say that another reason it's a terrible move is that if Texas does this, they're going to create the most powerful AI regulator in America. Just and quite possibly the world, given that we're the capital of AI. And say what you want about a state government doing that. There's a lot of things I could say.
Yeah.
But one thing that's for sure is that California will not long tolerate Texas having more power over their AI industry than their own government. And so I think that what this will do is trigger an arms race, at least among the big states, to create AI regulators that will have competing and dueling rules. The regulator that Trega is trying to create has rulemaking authority, the ability to issue binding rules to ensure the ethical and responsible development and deployment of AI. It's a huge mandate.
Yep.
So they can do whatever they want, really. We don't have that for like the internet or electricity. Yeah. We have agencies that regulate the electrical grid, but we don't have an agency that regulates like the responsible use of electricity by businesses, right? Yeah. And that's kind of what you're talking about creating.
Yeah, that's a good point. So
it's really kind of madness, in my opinion.
Yeah. And for the audience, like, this is called the Texas Responsible AI Governance Act. So we're using the acronym pronounced TREGA. It's House Bill 1709 by Representative Capriglione in Texas. And, and I've known Capriglione for a number of years. He's a good guy. I think probably his intentions are in the right place on this. But the problem is where it's actually going. So what I've heard from the folks in Texas, I live in Texas. I'm near Austin, Texas. And the idea is that this would be the new conservative approach to regulating AI. But to your point, it's going even further than the one that was passed in Colorado, because there's kind of been this rollout of different types of bills. You had Colorado, Connecticut, California, but Colorado is the main one. But you also have some others like Utah that's been connected to the American Legislative Exchange Council. They have model legislation kind of similar to that. And so there's been kind of this competing ideas, and it's almost, to your point, Dean, like Texas went even worse than the bad ideas that were already out there, right?
Yeah. Like it's kind of incredible. I think part of it is that there is this kind of emerging, and I think Representative Capriglione has been a part of this, this kind of idea that Texas is going to emerge as a counterweight to California in tech policy, and that Texas is a big state too. And that Texas will, increasingly the way the country will work is that California and New York are going to set the laws, the tech regulations that the blue states will follow, and Texas and Florida will set the tech regulations that the red states will follow. Yeah. And, I'm a fan of federalism. I did state and local policy for a decade. So I'm okay. Kind of like, all right, cool. Like fun experiment we can do. I'm sure lots of good economics you can do. Yeah. Lots of interesting econometrics to be done, I would suspect, in such a world. But I would say that if we're talking about the foundational rules for, this is not social media. Social media is not a macro invention. It's not a general purpose technology. The foundational rules for what may well be the most important general purpose technology in the history of the world, and I think it really could be, we really need to do that that's one of the things where like I'm a pretty ardent federalist.
Yeah.
I've done my whole career really is state and local policy, and even the Coolidge Foundation. Coolidge federalism is deeply important to President Coolidge. I don't think I can get behind a patchwork of rules for something, the foundational rules.
Yeah.
So I think that is a formula for the country, like kind of splitting apart.
Yep. Yeah. It's also, it's made tension for me too, because I'm also a federalist and I believe in the laboratory of competition among the states and let them do what they're going to do in order to be as competitive and come up with the best ideas possible. But for something like this, to your point, that's so foundational to the future of our country and could stifle things. I mean, if we have AI and this patchwork quilt of regulations in each state, basically, I mean, these AI companies will have to go to the worst case scenario. Okay, what's going to happen if this is caught in California and New York versus Texas and Florida? Well, I better adhere to what's happening in California and New York. We've already seen that some with our CAFE standards, right? California has had these very restrictive CAFE standards, and that's created a situation where it's cost us all more in the process. And so it has been, I'll admit, it's a little bit, it creates a tension for me as well, ideologically and philosophically and everything else, because I'm like, well, I usually don't want the federal government to do anything, but this is probably a good idea for Congress to pass something that will set the rules of the game. I mean, even in free market capitalism, you want the government to be a referee, set the rules of the game, and let the market people be the participants in the market. And unfortunately, all of these states are trying to be referees to determine what's going on and a player in the game. And that's not going to head us in a good direction. I wonder, Dean, do you like kind of the Utah ALEC sort of model legislations, or do you have something else in mind when it comes to Congress and other things happening in DC?
So I think the Utah bill is a really good and interesting start. I think the idea of creating the regulatory sandboxes and the sort of basic standard, there is actually like some basic liability stuff in there, kind of. I mean, really just saying like the model did it is not an excuse, right? Which I actually think that's not crazy, right?
Yeah.
Like that's it's not crazy it doesn't matter who you are, right? Like if you're a maker of a self-driving car company, we definitely want to incentivize people to make self-driving cars. But if your self-driving car hits somebody and there was nobody behind the wheel, it's definitely not an excuse for you as the developer of that AI system to say, the model did it.
Yeah.
Oh, so no one can be sued because the model did it. Like that's not the reason liability exists is to create good incentives, and so like I as a classical liberal, like I think the court system and liability are like an important part of how we balance all of this. So I think, Utah like took some baby steps in that direction. I think it's a good thing for states to be doing. I don't think it's everything we will need for AI governance, to be sure. But there's this big debate in AI policy between like, do we regulate the uses or do we regulate the models? And this is a bit of and like most libertarians would be on the regulate the uses, not the models side of things. And I'm actually a little different, and I'll explain why. Okay. So like for sure, to some extent, it's true. Like regulate the uses, fine. Yeah. Like if you don't want people making pornographic deepfakes of other people, and distributing them, fine. Make that probably the world's not going to change so much that we like desire that there to be more of that behavior. So if you want to disincentivize that through the civil or criminal legal system, fine.
Yeah.
But in general, I think regulating the uses of a general purpose technology are in fact way harder than having light touch regulations on the technology itself. And so like I would prefer a world where we have model developers who have to go through a limited series of basic sort of reliability, safety tests, things like that, to make sure that their models are not going to create chaos in the world. And I'm specifically thinking like not about the chatbots that we're talking about today. I'm trying to think about where the sort of where the ball's going. So I'm thinking about things like agents that will like take actions on your, we already have some of these. They're going to get more powerful. Models that are taking complex actions like an employee might, someone that you like a remote worker might for you. I think we like want to make sure that those things are reliable and that they're not trying to go around. Like if I tell it to go get the lowest price from a flight from American Airlines, that doesn't mean hack American Airlines. That means like find the lowest market rate price, right? But like you can imagine a world where a model might misinterpret that. Models do things like that all the time. I think, you want to, it's so much easier to just tell the developers, like, look, you have to put your models through, like, you don't have to, we're not asking you to make sure they'll never hurt anybody or nothing will ever go wrong. We're asking you to try to mitigate like actual, like serious harms that we all agree we don't want more of. And then kind of like, I'm a bit of a Burkean about the uses, like let's let it happen. Mm-hmm. And if there's use, like, let's not try to preemptively, I just can't imagine like if you're a financial services regulator and you're trying to think about like, how do I regulate the use of like a company that could have thousands of human level intelligences at its disposal, like, what do you say to that? I think what you basically do is say, look, like we have these existing laws that we've come up with and like a lot of them kind of stink and we all agree, but we have them. And like to some extent, to a first approximation, they codify the standards of behavior we wish to see in the world. And if you have a problem, if these laws are causing you, like the Utah thing, if these laws are causing you problems in adopting AI, let us know. Let's try to come up with, a regulatory sandbox for you. Let's try to come up with a workaround. And otherwise, like if new harms emerge, like let's deal with them after they emerge. Yeah. Rather than trying to come up with something rationalistic sort of from the ground up. I just think that's never going to work. So anyway, I think the use-based thing is like, it's good in the sense of like, for things that we all agree are bad, but like, don't go crazy with it. Yeah.
So it's kind of like, don't use a blanket sort of policy, but more of a targeted policy if it's needed at all. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. That makes a lot of sense. I wonder too, Dean, cause this is fascinating. Thank you for taking the time to discuss this today. I wonder what are some of the other things that you are working on, kind of the AI, other spaces. You and I have talked a little bit about energy. I know that in Texas and some other states, in particular Texas, since that's where I live, there's a big concern about like data centers and data and all the energy that it's taking in. My kind of perspective on this, and I should say, like Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick has been a big against the data centers and what's going to happen in the future. And over the next 10 years, I think 50% of the new energy usage, electricity usage, is probably going to be data centers, is what they're forecasting just in Texas. My idea on this is that we actually need more energy abundance. Instead of limiting the AI and data centers, is that we need to figure out ways to have more energy, which I think is really held back by regulations and things of that nature, like the small nuclear reactors, modular reactors, SMRs, and stuff like that. I think could help revolutionize a lot of those things. But I wonder what some of your thoughts are in that space.
Yeah, I mean, in a broad sense, I fully agree with you that I think the path forward here is, is energy abundance. I mean, if you look, there was a chart that was going around on Twitter the other day. There was the U.S. versus China electricity capacity. And the U.S., over the last like maybe decade or two, and the U.S. was basically just like a flat line, like maybe going up a little bit. And China was like a hockey stick, a true hockey stick, just straight up and just embarrassing us at this point. Now, they're a much bigger, that's measured in wattage. Right. That's not wattage per capita.
Right.
So they are a much bigger country than we are. It is worth noting. And so a lot of that is like to provide people with a standard of living that we would consider third world.
Yeah.
In this country. So, caveat emptor on graphs, on decontextualized statistics. But nonetheless, it's important. And I mean, I think not only do we need to have energy abundance, but I think that we've had like very close to like precisely the wrong energy policy in America in the last 50 years. We did the all the environmental permitting and other regulations, mostly the permitting and the sort of process-based laws like NEPA, and there's also state-based, the National Environmental Policy Act. That's where, like, when you hear about infrastructure projects that are, this, of course, but for the listener, like when you hear about infrastructure projects that are, delayed by decades and decades, very often that's because of litigation under NEPA. Even things like government efforts to fight wildfires are held up for years by NEPA review, and that's basically people suing to hold things up. So that's a big mess. And then we've subsidized these forms of electricity that are really quite bad. In terms of physics, there's a lot of people on the in the abundance world who like solar panels, but like I'm here to tell you, like, they don't have the energy density. The solar panels have better energy density than wind. But solar panels can make sense in some places. In fact, I have solar panels on my own roof. But in general, they don't have. We're not going to build. We're not going to keep building a frontier economy. A truly first. Like, we're not going to build all the energy we need for AI with solar. And they have reliability problems as well. And so for that reason, like, typically when you have to build solar panel, we've been subsidizing all this solar and wind for the last like 20, 30 years. And so there's these very generous subsidies that everybody wants to take. But the reality is that these are unreliable sources of electricity. And so, and batteries have not been good enough. They might get good enough, but they haven't been. So every time you add a utility scale solar and wind, you have to build natural gas. So we are getting, one grid for the price of two. And we've also basically illegalized nuclear energy, which is like highest reliability, highest energy density.
Agreed.
So there's like, I think there's so much low hanging fruit that we have, that we can pluck. And then there's also all kinds of promising new things. The one thing, that we do right better than anybody else in the world, in America, is landowners own the land underneath, underneath their feet. You own, from the soil to the center of the earth, right? And that's not true in most of the world. Most of the world, the government owns the public. Well, the government owns the land, owns what's below a certain, not too high. So if you find oil underneath on your property, you don't own it. The government does. In America, we have the opposite. That has created this incredibly diverse and rich ecosystem of hydrocarbon entrepreneurs in America, and they've done amazing stuff, incredibly technologically sophisticated stuff. Fracking is super cool. Obviously, a lot of it happens in Texas, so I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But the other thing that's amazing about it is we've gotten so good at it now that we can drill so deep into the earth that all of a sudden we're getting to the point where advanced geothermal is becoming a thing. So like typically geothermal only works in places like Iceland, where you're like very close to like super geologically active, volcanoes and stuff like that. And so there's lots of hot water kind of like right near the surface. And so you can get at that really easily. That's worked for a long time. But what's starting to emerge is we can use the fracking technology to go miles deep into the earth, and we can get at hot water, down there, essentially, hot rocks. That is basically something you can build anywhere. And so that's incredibly cool. And then obviously there's also, even things like nuclear fusion, which some people really believe. I'm a little more skeptical, but I think there's a pretty good chance that we could actually have working nuclear fusion reactors within a few years.
Wow.
So there's a lot of promise, but we've really screwed up.
Yeah. Sometimes before you get going with more government, we actually need to get government out of the way. And too often, Dean, as you've probably seen too, I mean, and I talk about this on the show, is you've got more of this progressive mentality from the left to the right of the political spectrum nowadays, where if we see something that we don't like, well, let's have government do it. Let's ban it or regulate it or something else. And I'm hopeful that we can get away from that sooner rather than later before we do end up hurting the future of our country, whether it's AI, national security, and so many other things that are at the forefront of the frontier, as you put there. Using AI, I think is going to be really important. And I hope that the audience has learned a lot from you today. You're a wealth of knowledge. Where's the best place to find you? And what other closing remarks would you like to say to get off your mind today?
My Substack is called Hyperdimensional. That's just hyperdimensional.co. And then you can find me on Twitter at Dean W. Ball. You can also just Google my name and you'll find all these things pretty readily. And in terms of closing thoughts, I think, what I would say is you probably have a wide range of sort of like enthusiasts to skeptics of AI among the listeners, because there's a lot, there's a lot of them. And I hear a lot of the skepticism, like I get it. But what I would say is, it's really worth trying to learn how to use the very most capable models that are on the market today. OpenAI's O1, DeepSeek, the Chinese company, they released a competitor called R1 that's free. You can go, try that out too. There's some really incredible stuff. And if you tried AI 2 years ago and you were like, this thing is stupid, I would suggest coming back.
Yeah.
I would suggest coming back because we've had a lot of progress since then.
Definitely. Hey, wise words, Dean. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. I look forward to the work that you're going to continue to do, and keep up the way to let people prosper. Okay. And God bless you and your family. And I look forward to talking to you soon.
Vance, thank you so much. It's been great.
Great. Thank you, Dean. For the audience, thank y'all for listening today. Please go out and share this with your friends and families. Get us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening or watching this podcast episode. Remember, you can find all this information and more at vanceginn.com, or go to my Substack, vanceginn.substack.com, where I'll put links to Dean's work and all the other great stuff that he's doing. Until next time, God bless you and let people prosper.